The moment that changes everything rarely sounds dramatic. There is no slammed door, no perfectly delivered speech, no mic drop confession that finally exposes them. Instead, it arrives quietly, almost invisibly, when you stop explaining yourself to someone who was never listening. Most people believe narcissists are unmasked by confrontation, by facts, by proof, by finally saying the right words. That belief keeps people trapped for years, because narcissists don't unravel when you speak. They unravel when you don't. Picture this. You've done everything you were told was healthy. You stayed calm. You chose your words carefully. You explained your intentions again and again. You even apologized for things you didn't do, hoping peace would follow. But instead of relief, the tension grew thicker. The more reasonable you became, the more unhinged the situation felt. That wasn't a coincidence. That was the system working exactly as designed. Narcissistic dynamics feed on engagement, on reaction, on emotional output. Your voice, your defense, your logic, your pain became the fuel that kept the engine running. And here's the part no one prepares you for. When you finally go quiet, the narcissist doesn't feel relieved. They feel threatened. Silence removes the mirror they depend on to feel powerful. It disrupts the illusion that they are in control of the emotional environment. When you stop narrating, defending, or performing your role, something deeply unsettling happens. The story loses its audience. The performance starts to wobble. This kind of silence isn't passive. It's deliberate. It says, I am no longer participating in a reality that costs me my sanity. And that message lands far louder than any accusation ever could. At first, silence feels terrifying. You may worry you're being cold, cruel, weak, but over time, you'll notice something shift. The chaos no longer belongs to you. The mask begins to slip, not because you pulled it off, but because you stopped holding it in place. If this resonates, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations going, and the next part of this story may change how you see everything. Before we continue, here's a quick question for you. Which do you think unsettles a narcissist more? A. Being confronted with the truth. B. Being met with calm. Intentional silence. Comment A or B below. The invisible war. How narcissistic conflict really works. What makes narcissistic conflict so disorienting is that it never feels like a fair fight. On the surface, it looks like a disagreement, a misunderstanding, a rough patch two people should be able to talk through. But underneath, something far more calculated is taking place. By the time you realize you're exhausted, confused, and doubting yourself, the war has already been going on for a long time. Emily didn't understand this at first. Living in Boston with Victor, she assumed conflict worked the way it always had in her life. Two people exchange perspectives, emotions rise, resolution eventually follows. But arguments with Victor never moved toward resolution. They stretched. They looped. They returned weeks later in different disguises. Every conversation felt unfinished, like a door that never fully closed. That's because narcissistic conflict is not about solving a problem. It's about maintaining control. Victor didn't argue to understand Emily. He argued to dominate the emotional terrain. He shifted timelines, reframed past conversations, and questioned her tone rather than addressing the issue. If she stayed calm, he accused her of being cold. If she expressed emotion, he labeled her unstable. No response ever landed safely, because safety was never the goal. This is the invisible war most people don't recognize until they are deep inside it. Narcissistic personalities use repetition, emotional whiplash, and prolonged engagement as weapons. The longer the conflict lasts, the more worn down the other person becomes. Fatigue replaces clarity. Self-trust erodes. Eventually, survival instincts kick in. and the goal shifts from resolution to relief. Emily began to notice something unsettling. Victor never seemed tired after these exchanges. She did. He could go for hours, revisiting the same accusations with calm precision, while she felt herself fraying. That imbalance wasn't accidental. Narcissistic conflict feeds on your energy while conserving theirs. This is why logic doesn't save you here. Logic assumes shared reality and good faith. Narcissistic conflict operates on distortion and endurance. If you stay in the arena long enough, you don't lose the argument, you lose yourself. Understanding this isn't about assigning blame. It's about clarity. Once you see the war for what it is, you stop mistaking participation for progress. And that awareness becomes the first real step towards stepping out of a fight you were never meant to win. The high cost of self-control. The time Emily realized how much self-control she was using just to survive. The cost had already been paid in full. It wasn't visible at first. There were no dramatic breakdowns, no obvious warning signs. What appeared instead was a quiet erosion of energy, of joy, of self-recognition. Living with Victor required constant calibration. Emily learned to measure her tone before speaking, to soften her words before they left her mouth, to anticipate which version of Victor might be waiting on the other side of the conversation. She told herself this was maturity, emotional intelligence, strength. In reality, it was adaptation under pressure. Self-control became a full-time job. Emily wasn't just managing her emotions. She was managing the entire emotional climate of the relationship. She monitored his moods, avoided certain topics, and swallowed reactions that would have been natural anywhere else. Over time, those swallowed reactions didn't disappear. They turned inward. Her body noticed before her mind did. She felt exhausted even after sleeping. Her thoughts moved slower. She struggled to feel excitement or anger or sadness in any full-bodied way. Everything felt muted. People praised her for being so calm, never realizing that calm had come at the expense of being alive. This is the hidden tax of narcissistic dynamics. Survivors often mistake numbness for peace and restraint for safety. But sustained self-control under emotional threat is not regulation, it is survival. The nervous system stays braced, waiting for the next shift, the next provocation, the next demand to stay composed no matter what is said or implied. The breaking point, when it comes, often arrives with shame attached. When Emily finally snapped during a late-night argument, she hated herself for it. Victor, predictably, seized the moment as proof that she was just as bad. What no one acknowledged was how long she had been holding everything together with sheer will. That moment wasn't weakness. It was evidence. Evidence that no human can endlessly suppress themselves without consequence. The high cost of self-control is not just exhaustion. It is disconnection from your own internal truth. Healing doesn't begin by trying harder to stay calm. It begins when you stop demanding silence from the parts of you that have been screaming to be heard. Why now? One believes you, at first. One of the most devastating moments in a narcissistic relationship is not what happens behind closed doors, but what happens when you finally try to speak about it. You choose your words carefully. You soften the edges. You share just enough, hoping someone will recognize the pain underneath. And instead of validation, you're met with confusion, disbelief, or silence. Emily experienced this long before she ever named what was happening with Victor. Friends in Boston described him as intelligent, composed, even generous. Coworkers admired his confidence. Family members praised his strong personality. When Emily hinted that things felt wrong at home, the responses were polite but dismissive. Every couple argues. He seems so put together. Maybe you're just stressed. What no one saw was how carefully curated Victor's public self was. Narcissistic individuals often understand optics better than intimacy. They know how to perform stability, kindness, and charm when it serves them. The cruelty, the distortion, the subtle erosion of another person's reality rarely makes it in the public view. That work is done in private, where there are no witnesses. Over time, this disbelief does something insidious. Emily didn't just feel unsupported. She began to question herself. If no one else saw what she was seeing, maybe she was exaggerating. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe she was the problem. This is how isolation becomes internalized. You stop trusting your perception because the world keeps reflecting a different story back at you. Unknowingly, Emily also played a role in maintaining that story. She explained Victor's behavior. She minimized incidents. She protected his reputation to avoid conflict or embarrassment. In doing so, she became the translator between his private chaos and public image. The mask stayed intact because she kept adjusting it. The shift begins when you stop managing how others perceive them. You don't need to convince anyone of your pain. When you step back from explaining, justifying, and smoothing over, reality starts to speak on its own terms. Not being believed is profoundly painful, but it is not proof that you're wrong. Often, it's proof that you've been carrying far more than anyone realized, and that the truth has been waiting for space to breathe. Don't take the bait. And what happens when you don't? Advice sounds simple. Don't take the bait. But no one tells you what that actually means or what it will cost you when you finally try. Because bait doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like urgency. Sometimes like guilt. Sometimes like a crisis that seems impossible to ignore. When Emily stopped engaging with Victor the way she always had, she expected things to quiet down. Instead, the opposite happened. His words sharpened. His accusations grew heavier. He reached for the places he knew would hurt most: her empathy, her sense of responsibility, her fear of being seen as heartless. This wasn't random. It was strategic. Narcissistic bait exists for one purpose: to pull you back into emotional motion. When reactions disappear, control weakens. So the pressure intensifies. Victor reframed Emily's silence as cruelty. He accused her of abandoning him, of changing, of becoming someone cold and unrecognizable. At moments, he even sounded wounded, as if her calm were an act of violence. This is the phase where most people break. Not because they are weak, but because the escalation feels unbearable. Silence begins to feel dangerous. The nervous system screams that something must be done, something must be said, just to make the tension stop. That impulse is exactly what the bait is designed to trigger. Emily learned that not taking the bait didn't mean standing still forever. It meant choosing when and how she engaged. She shortened conversations. She ended them when they crossed certain lines. She stopped correcting distortions that were clearly intentional. Each time she didn't respond, she felt waves of anxiety, but also a strange sense of integrity returning. What surprised her most was what followed. After repeated attempts failed, Victor began to lose momentum. The arguments collapsed without her energy to sustain them. The accusations lingered in the air, unanswered, awkward. Without reaction, they had nowhere to land. Not taking the bait isn't about winning. It's about refusing to be consumed. It requires preparation, self-awareness, and compassion for your own limits. But over time, something becomes clear. The bait only works when you believe you are responsible for fixing what someone else is determined to break. And when you stop reaching for it, the dynamic begins to change, not because they understand, but because the game no longer has two players. When the mask slips in private, there is a moment that comes after silence and escalation when the narcissist changes tactics. The anger softens. The accusations quiet. What replaces them can feel almost tender. This is the phase that confuses people the most, because it looks like the very thing you've been waiting for, For Emily, it happened late one evening after weeks of disengagement. Victor sat across from her, suddenly subdued. His voice was low. His eyes looked tired. He spoke about feeling misunderstood, about fear, about how lonely he had been. He apologized not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to sound sincere. For the first time in a long while, he seemed human. This is when the mask slips, but only in private. Narcissistic vulnerability often emerges not as accountability, but as emotional exposure without responsibility. Victor didn't name specific behaviors. He didn't acknowledge patterns. Instead, he shared feelings that invited empathy while quietly bypassing the harm he had caused. Emily felt herself soften immediately. Her instinct was to reassure him, to close the distance, to believe that this moment meant something had finally shifted. That instinct wasn't naive, it was conditioned. Trauma bonds thrive on intermittent warmth after prolonged cold. Relief can feel indistinguishable from hope. What makes this phase so dangerous is how closely it mimics growth. The words sound right. The tone feels different. The real change is not measured by emotional intensity. It's measured by consistency over time. And consistency was exactly what was missing. After that night, Victor's behavior returned to familiar patterns. The same provocations, the same subtle distortions, the same need for control. The vulnerability hadn't been a turning point, it had been a reset. This is where discernment matters. Compassion does not require you to abandon clarity. You can acknowledge someone's pain without re-entering a dynamic that erases you. Emily began to watch what Victor did when he was frustrated, when he felt challenged, when no one was watching. That told her more than any apology ever could. When the mask slips in private, it's tempting to believe you're finally seeing the real person. But the real measure isn't how someone shows up in moments of emotional exposure. It's how they behave when they don't get what they want. Understanding this doesn't make you cold. It makes you grounded. And it protects you from mistaking temporary softness for lasting change, which is often the last illusion narcissistic dynamics ask you to surrender. Letting consequences speak louder than you ever did. For a long time, Emily believed that preventing disaster was part of loving Victor. She stepped in before mistakes became visible. She softened his words after they landed too hard. She fixed plans, smoothed social moments, and quietly absorbed the fallout so no one else had to. What she didn't realize was that every rescue kept the mask intact. Letting consequences unfold felt terrifying at first. It went against her instincts. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't indifferent yet. She simply stopped intervening. When Victor made promises he couldn't keep, she no longer covered for him. When he created conflict in public settings, she didn't rush to de-escalate or apologize on his behalf. She stayed present, calm, and silent. The shift was subtle but powerful. Without Emily buffering the impact, Victor's behavior began to land where it belonged. People noticed the tension. Plans fell apart without an explanation attached. Awkward moments lingered instead of being smoothed over. Nothing dramatic happened, but something irreversible did. Reality became visible. This stage carries grief. Emily mourned the version of herself who believed she could manage everything if she just tried harder. She mourned the fantasy that love meant sacrifice without limit. Watching things fall apart without stepping in felt like a personal failure, even though it wasn't. It was the undoing of a role she had never consciously agreed to play. Victor reacted predictably. He blamed her for letting things happen. He accused her of changing, of being selfish, of refusing to help. What he never acknowledged was that these were the natural outcomes of his own choices. Outcomes he had rarely been allowed to face before. Letting consequences speak is not an act of punishment. It is an act of truth. It removes you from the position of shield and places responsibility back where it belongs. Over time, Emily noticed something unexpected. Her sense of self began to return. Without constantly fixing and managing, she could finally see situations clearly. This step often brings clarity before validation. Others may not immediately name what they're seeing, but they feel it. And more importantly, you feel it. When consequences are allowed to do the talking, you no longer have to prove anything. You stop explaining. You stop arguing. You stop carrying weight that was never yours. And in that space, something quieter but stronger begins to grow. Trust in your own perception, restored not by words, but by reality itself. Indifference. The line they cannot cross. Indifference does not arrive all at once. It grows quietly, almost unnoticed, after hope has been exhausted and explanations have lost their meaning. For Emily, it didn't come from anger or resentment. It came from clarity. A moment when she realized that caring deeply had never protected her, and caring less was not the same as cruelty. Indifference is often misunderstood. People imagine it as coldness, punishment, or the silent treatment. In reality, it is emotional neutrality. It is the absence of urgency. It is no longer feeling responsible for managing someone else's inner world. And for a narcissistic dynamic, this is the line that cannot be crossed. Victor sensed the shift before Emily named it. His usual tactics, provocation, guilt, charm, even vulnerability, began to fall flat. When he accused her of being distant, she didn't rush to reassure him. When he attempted to reignite conflict, she didn't escalate or defend. Her responses were brief, calm, and uncharged. Not because she was trying to teach him a lesson, but because she no longer felt pulled into the orbit of his emotions. This is what makes indifference so destabilizing. Narcissistic control relies on emotional investment. It requires you to care enough to react. When that investment disappears, the familiar strategies stop working. There is nothing to push against, nothing to hook into. The dynamic loses its leverage. Reaching indifference required Emily to rebuild parts of herself she had neglected. She reconnected with interests that had nothing to do with Victor. She spent time with people who didn't demand constant explanation. She began making decisions based on her values rather than anticipated fallout. Slowly, her identity expanded beyond the relationship. Victor responded with confusion and accusation. He called her manipulative, cold, accused her of withholding. These labels were attempts to provoke guilt, to pull her back into engagement. But without emotional charge behind them, the words drifted past her. Indifference is not about winning. It is about freedom. It marks the moment when someone else's chaos no longer dictates your internal state. Few people reach this place, and it cannot be forced. But when it arrives, it changes everything. Because once you are indifferent, the mask no longer matters. The performance has no audience. And for the first time, your peace belongs entirely to you. Letting others see what you stopped hiding. One of the hardest shifts Emily made had nothing to do with Victor directly. It was the moment she stopped stepping in front of him when his behavior began to show. For years, she had acted as a buffer, anticipating tension, smoothing awkward moments, quietly redirecting conversations before they became uncomfortable. She told herself she was being kind. What she was really doing was hiding the truth from everyone, including herself. When Emily stopped intervening, the discomfort didn't disappear. It moved. The unease she had been carrying alone now entered the room. At first, this felt unbearable. Old habits screamed at her to fix it, to explain, to protect everyone from the awkwardness. Silence felt like exposure, like betrayal, like failure. Victor noticed immediately. Without Emily managing the atmosphere, his irritability surfaced in public. Comments landed too sharply. Small frustrations escalated. The charm that once covered everything slipped at the edges. And for the first time, Emily did not rush to translate his behavior into something more palatable. What followed was not instant validation. Some people felt confused. Others were annoyed. A few seemed uncomfortable with Emily for not handling the situation the way she always had. This revealed something painful but important. Many had grown used to her, absorbing the emotional cost so they didn't have to. Letting others see is not about exposure or revenge. It is about stepping out of a role that was never sustainable. Emily didn't point things out. She didn't label Victor. She didn't narrate what was happening. She simply stopped hiding it. And in that absence of explanation, behavior began to speak for itself. Some people noticed quickly. Others needed time. A few never saw it at all. But Emily learned something crucial. Other people's awareness was no longer her responsibility. Her job was not to manage perception. It was to live in alignment with reality. This step often stirs guilt. When you've spent years protecting others from someone's dysregulation, stepping back can feel selfish. But guilt does not mean you are doing something wrong. It often means you are doing something new. By allowing others to witness what she had stopped hiding, Emily reclaimed a quiet dignity. She no longer had to carry the entire truth alone. And even when others didn't name what they saw, she felt the shift inside herself. The weight lifted not because everyone finally understood, but because she no longer needed them to. The ending that isn't loud. Emily once believed that healing would arrive with clarity, so sharp it would feel like justice. She imagined a moment when everything would finally make sense, when Victor would be exposed, when others would understand, when the truth would land so decisively that nothing could deny it. But the ending did not come that way. It came quietly, without witnesses, without ceremony, and without permission from anyone else. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic apology, no public reckoning. What changed instead was something far more subtle and far more permanent. Emily stopped waiting. She stopped scanning rooms for validation, stopped hoping someone would finally say, "I see it now." The story no longer needed an audience to feel real. Victor continued being who he had always been. In some ways, that was the clearest truth of all. The difference was that Emily was no longer orienting her life around that reality. His reactions, moods, and narratives lost their gravitational pull. They existed, but they no longer defined her internal landscape. This is the ending most people aren't prepared for. There is no applause for choosing yourself. No external marker that announces you've crossed the finish line. Often, people around you remain confused, indifferent, or unchanged. And yet, something inside you has settled. The chaos no longer follows you home. Emily noticed a change in small ways. She slept better. She trusted her instincts again. Decisions felt cleaner, less tangled with fear or anticipation. Silence no longer felt like danger. It felt like space. She didn't need to prove what had happened or justify why she had stepped back. Her nervous system already knew the truth. This ending isn't loud because it doesn't need to be. It isn't about exposing someone else. It's about reclaiming yourself. Radical acceptance doesn't mean approval, it means release. You stop fighting reality and start building a life that doesn't require constant defense. By the time the mask fully falls, if it ever does, you may not be watching anymore. Not because you didn't care, but because you finally learned where your care belonged. And that is the quiet ending that matters most. Conclusion. What Emily's story teaches. Emily's journey did not end with a dramatic escape or a public revelation. It ended with something far quieter and far more meaningful. Over time, she stopped fighting battles that could never be won, stopped explaining herself to someone committed to misunderstanding her, and stopped measuring her worth by Victor's reactions. What looked from the outside like withdrawal was, on the inside, a profound return to herself. The most important shift was not Victor changing. He didn't. The shift was Emily recognizing that clarity does not require consensus. She learned that silence can be self-respect, that boundaries do not need speeches, and that disengagement is sometimes the most honest response available. By stepping out of the role of regulator, rescuer, and translator, she allowed reality to take its natural shape. The mask didn't fall because she ripped it off. It fell because she stopped holding it up. The deeper lesson here is not just about narcissism. It is about where we place our energy. Many people spend years trying to fix dynamics that are structurally broken, believing that more effort, more patience, or more love will eventually make things right. Emily's story reminds us that healing often begins when we stop asking, "How do I make this work?" and start asking, "What is this costing me?" Applying this lesson to your own life doesn't require cutting people off overnight or becoming emotionally closed. It begins with awareness. Notice where you feel drained after conversations. Notice where you over-explain, over-function, or silence yourself to keep the peace. Small acts pausing before responding, choosing not to engage, letting consequences unfold, can slowly restore your sense of self. You don't need to be believed by everyone to move forward. You don't need a loud ending to justify your pain. Sometimes, the most powerful change happens when you quietly choose yourself. Quick question. For you, which do you believe creates real healing? A finally being understood by the other person. B. Understanding yourself and acting accordingly. Comment A or B below. Disclaimer. This video is for educational and knowledge-sharing purposes only and does not replace professional diagnosis or treatment. From a licensed mental health professional, what are your thoughts or experiences with this kind of dynamic? Share your perspective in the comments so others can learn from you as well. And if this content resonates, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep creating thoughtful, meaningful videos like this.